Welcome everybody to the second session of today's conference, and this session is entitled A Mind of Two Tongues, which will draw attention to the liminal zone where concepts get altered through the act of translation and the materiality of words and tongues get lost in between shifts from one to another. The two speakers of this session, Vincenzo Lacronizzo, I'm sorry, Italian's not my forte, and Arnisa Zecco will provide insights to the mishaps of linguistic relativity and at times language learning and unlearning to open up the implicit complexities present in our entanglements in the ownership of multiple tongues, and in extreme cases, let slip our own mother tongues. Well, today I'm very thrilled to have Vincenzo and Arnisa here to share their thoughts on these issues. And as an introduction, I would just like to bring forward some loose ideas and questions that I have been thinking about during the research on this subject. Well, in this day and age, it is commonplace for most of us sitting here to speak at least two languages and inhabit different language worlds. While English has become our lingua franca and defined our global paradigm through its prevalence, it has also provided points of reference in shaping the linguistic and cultural prism from which we look through and analyze the world, as well as other cultures and languages. At present, non-native English speakers outpopulate native English speakers. Currently, there's 359 million native English speakers, and there are more than 765 million English speakers at the moment. Well, it's also very important to note that the two most spoken languages, in fact, not English. It's Mandarin Chinese and Spanish. Of course, the widespread use of English has its historical reasons in trade and colonialism, and its continued evolution from the original, or should we say the standard, to the multiple Englishes that has been created through its use and circulation across the world in different regions and specialized professional fields. Well, a case in point is Globish, for example, which defines itself not as a language, but uses a subset of standard English grammar and a list of 1,500 English words, which forms the common ground that non-native English speakers adopt in the context of international business, which is in a way, one could say, like English made easy. And of course, let's not forget, there's also the new term that we've been kind of preoccupied with the last 2 years, or at least also in this recent issue of eFlux, International Art English, which caters to a specific fields that we all are in, and Vincenzo will go deeper into that later. But even if we speak English, Dutch, maybe in the Netherlands, or any other language in varying capacities, there's a certain amount of language trafficking, which is the transmutation and transferal of meanings across different linguistic territories and borders that we have to go through on a daily basis, either as transplants in a foreign country or when speaking to friends and colleagues who do not share your mother tongue. In fact, we're constantly in the process of translating. These translations happen beyond the mere shifts from your mother tongue you might be thinking in or accustomed to communicating in to, for example, English, but also from the abstract ideas into words and sentences in a language. But do we say the same things when it is translated from one tongue to another? Walter Benjamin, in his text, the task of the translator, stressed the importance of intention in using words in the act of translation and linguistic relativity. He writes, next slide. Okay. The words brood and pan intend the same object, but the modes of the intention are not the same. It is owning to these modes that the word brood means something different to a German than the word pan to a Frenchman, that these words are not interchangeable for them. As the intended object, however, the two words mean the very same thing. So this is an image I just found on Google, just wrote the word Brot in German, and this is what I found writing bread in French. Well, while Brot is the correct translation for pain and refers to the exact same thing, And yet the two words do not necessarily denote the same intention in the context of the two speakers. Even if you can achieve the right translation, word for word, one might not be able to communicate precisely what might not be discernible and uttered through a single word. Vincenzo, the first speaker of the session, in his text in Frieze, written in 2012, called The Tip of the Tongue, which is a text that has inspired a lot of thoughts in this session, wrote very extensively on his observation on the impact and emergence of what is now known as International Art English, to the potential ways in which art writing and concepts have been adjusted as artists and writers translate their own thoughts into English. And in his presentation, he will reflect and elaborate further on further on this topic. In his text, he referred to the example of Hans Belting and his frustration in the inability of translating one chapter in his book, An Anthropology of Images, written in 2011, into English. The chapter was eventually dropped, despite having been translated into French, Spanish, and other versions, as it seemed, in his own words, resist any meaningful translation. In his introduction to the New English Version, he writes, "Despite a close collaboration with the patient translator, who was an incredible help, the results are far from what I would like them to be. A book that has been thought and written in German should be rewritten and reconceived as a new book in English, a task impossible for me to even consider. Nam June Paik, a great artist and a playful user of languages such as German, English, French, Korean, and Japanese, once wrote that we believe we think with or in languages, but more often languages think with us." So there are two things that he touches upon here. One is whether concepts are bound to, a language, and are texts written in an original language untranslatable or difficult to be translated. And if we do indeed think with language, what is the extent in which language could potentially determine thoughts? Well, a revisit to George Orwell's dystopian vision in his book 1984 will remind us of the extreme way in which the limits or the censorship of language directly results in the manipulation of the complexity of thoughts through the creation of newspeak. In the totalitarian world constructed in Orwell's book, for instance, the word free, in newspeak, while still existing, could only function in one definition in the following contexts. The dog is free from lice, or this field is free from weeds. It is no longer embodying the old meaning of political or intellectual meaning of freedom, and as designated in Old Speak. In this new language itself, these concepts have ceased to exist, eradicated, and purged from the available vocabulary, impossible to be represented or produced, and hence come into being, at least within the realm of the public sphere. With that being said, that does not rule out the possibility, of course, of secret thoughts, private exchanges, and the misuse and creation of new lexicon, of course, the way in which Chinese netizens circumvent internet censorship is a very good case in point. Setting the fictive newspeak aside, where the limits of language or the loss of words could determine thoughts or mark the failure and slippages of linguistic representation and translation of ideas. In the translation across languages, for example, from Western thought and disciplines into non-European languages such as Chinese, Arabic, or vice versa, one might encounter the need to create new words that embody these otherwise foreign or culturally bound concepts in the face of linguistic asymmetry and cultural differences in histories. Yet does not mean that the absence of the same word in another language immediately denotes the non-existence of its corresponding meaning, or the impossibility of transmitting it. It might instead suggest, while such concepts might exist, it would need a particular effort of a translator to seek for meaning in other words or expressions, or by borrowing from other languages. At times, such acts of translations and wordsmithing might fail us, as J.M. Coetzee reminds us that translations sometimes don't work because How can we translate the materiality of words through translation? So there have been also much discussion and reflection on how identity might be bound by the tongue we speak in. Heidegger once characterized that language is our house of being, while the 19th century German thinker and linguist Wilhelm von Humboldt writes about each language carrying its own world peculiarity. So he writes, "Each tongue draws a circle about the people to whom it belongs, and it is possible to leave this circle only by simultaneously entering that of another people. Learning a foreign language ought hence to be the conquest of a new standpoint in the previously prevailing cosmic attitude of the individual. In fact, it is so to a certain extent, inasmuch as every language contains the entire fabric of concepts and the conceptual approach of a portion of humanity, and one always carries over into a foreign tongue to a greater or lesser degree one's own cosmic viewpoint, indeed one's personal linguistic pattern." So our mother tongues or personal linguistic patterns obliges us to think in a very particular way, or by prioritizing what we think, what needs to be said, and how, as well as making us more attentive to certain information, and in turn forming our experiences, memories, feelings, and orientation in the world through a set of linguistic lenses. And even though the possession of a tongue might imply a sense of belonging to a larger linguistic, cultural, national, or even transnational community, in the case of the non-native speaker, how does one situate oneself on a common ground based on a language alongside our native tongue or other tongues that we speak, or even are translated into? And what portion of humanity and view of the world is inscribed in these tongues? In J.M. Coetzee's letters to Paul Auster, he once wrote about his fraught relationship with English, his mother tongue, in which he found himself foreign to, thinking as a young boy that English was the property of the English, and it is something that he never was entitled to possess. What happens if one finds oneself alienated from our own mother tongue? Can one abandon one's own tongue? And how? In Arnisa's presentation, she will depart from her current fascination on what she calls the flesh of words, and trace the materiality of words, the confusion and the violence of and to languages through the motif of the tongue in linguistics, the Bible, and art history. I just want to share a really interesting picture I found on Facebook this morning, actually. Well, some of you can read Chinese. I guess everyone can read English. This is actually a page where I think Chinese or Cantonese speakers learn English by just transliteral kind of like writing of the words. For example, is I don't know which one should read. It's really complicated. Okay, at a police station reads at police station. So if you master this, what does that mean? Do you kind of like belong to this language or this culture? I mean, this is, because this is just mimicking sounds in a way, right? But we also cannot forget that learning a language fluently or actually being embodied in the language, one has to be part of that culture or not. I mean, that's a question I've been thinking about quite a lot. So to end, 2 weeks ago, BBC ran a story with the title "Learn 1,000 Words in a New Language Urges Campaign." In the reaction to the decreasing number of students taking up a second language in school, as the British are, quote, losing out on international trade and jobs because of poor language skills. Going back to the beginning of the introduction, where now one could fully master Globish in, let's say, 1,500 words, and communicate with our art colleagues in a peculiar form of international art English, the new ways in which we are using and in turn transforming English is a test to the paradigm of the native English speaker as the arbitrary kind of standard of proper English, At the same time, where people are sending their children to learn Chinese in anticipation of its growing economy, I think the discussion in this session was not really about seeking a new lingua franca, like in the failed project of Esperanto, but rather to consider the way in which we build our relationship to languages, while being mindful of the hegemonic implications, possibilities, and even influences on our thoughts that are made present to us in thinking about our juggling of languages and translation. Yeah, so that's what I want to end with. And I would now like to take the opportunity to invite our first speaker, Vincenzo, who would enlighten us a little bit more on the different mutations of English, the usage of English, and the impact of self-translation when we talk to our colleagues.
Thank you very much, Christina. I'll have to take away the belting paragraph from my talk. First of all, I'd like to apologize. The visual part of my talk will be extremely boring. This is the only image that there will be. There's going to be a short video in the end. Okay, this is a painting by Italian Renaissance painter Antonello da Messina. It was dated probably in 1474. And it depicts Saint Jerome, which the tradition holds to be the first translator of the Bible into Latin. You can see him, it's Saint Jerome in his study. There's a very famous like symbolic readings of every element, which are quite irrelevant to what I'm about to say. Being the first translator of the Bible, Saint Jerome is held in the Catholic religion to be the patron saint of translators. So it's in this capacity that he'll be watching over us in this talk. And it's also in this capacity that, like, even though I'm not religious, I am a translator. And I think of him very often. And one of the protections I most often ask for, as every translator, is more jobs. Which is why I was, no, seriously, which is why I was really excited this summer to learn that an art publisher based in Berlin, where I also live, called Sternberg Press, which some of you might know, was looking for a new editor. I was extremely excited. I've been working as a translator and as a writer and as a proofreader for 10 years now, and I read the posting with a thrill, thinking, okay, I made it at last. And I read the posting and I was recognizing that I met every qualification listed. But then I came to one last line that some of you or most of you might be familiar with, which is native English speaker required. Which struck me as a bit strange because it's not about a skill, but rather about a biological qualification. After that, of course, I didn't even bother applying because no matter how good my written English might be, it's nowhere near a native speaker's. In a way, of course, I didn't take this as, I didn't have a problem with this, and it made sense to me. As a writer, I understand the importance of precision and style, even in functional texts such as press releases or blurbs. Imagine in books. I also have published a novel in Italian, and I have to recognize I would never have wanted it edited by a non-native Italian speaker, no matter how long they might have lived in Italy or how familiar they might be with the Italian culture. I didn't feel there were any discrimination at all. It's only natural, if you're publishing books in English, that you would want a native English speaker as an editor and proofreader. Is it? I later thought more about it, and I thought, in a way, current art theory books do not really compare to novels. My novels are meant exclusively for an Italian audience. They're published in Milan by an Italian publisher. Their plots take place in Italy. The characters, most of them are Italian. And the themes relate to Italian culture, Italian politics, Italian society. They belong to a tradition of Italian literature that is consciously assumed to be sort of shared by their public, which is Italian. This is true of almost every novelistic tradition, except maybe the most recent American one, but this is for different reasons. On the other hand, this is not completely true of the art discourse, whatever that is. Those boundaries are not so precise. Of the forthcoming titles announced in the latest Sternberg press release, more than half were written by non-native English speakers. The publisher is in Germany. The owner of the publishing house is a woman from Luxembourg. It's public, it's from all over the world. Books about art are not, more often than not, are not written in English because they belong to an English or an American tradition. They're written in English because there's no other viable alternative to reach such a wide audience that is interested in the discourse around contemporary art. They're written in English because English is a lingua franca. It's the best possible option to grant a mutual understanding in a diverse international community. It's the same reason we are speaking English here, and we didn't even have to specify this on the program, even though this is taking place in the Netherlands. And I'm sure it's something to which we all have given some reflection. It's also what I would want to talk about today. But there is something I would not want to talk about that relates to this matter quite closely, which are the broader political implications of this fact. It's not because I find them irrelevant. They are extremely relevant and interesting, and they have been discussed extremely at depth. For instance, in the eFlux journal essays that Christina was referring to before, written by Martha Rosler and Hito Steyerl, I subscribe to most of what they've written there, and yet these political implications are obvious and to some extent unavoidable. Of course, the material cause, we're all speaking English here, has to do with globalization, with America's economical position and with Britain's colonial history, just as the cause for Latin being spoken in the 2nd century throughout Europe had to do with centurions and swords. But in a way, I feel that no deep insight will come to us from this fact. Any international community at any time, be they 14th century theologians, 19th century diplomats, or 20th century scientists, has had to find a common language. And this has most often been the language of power, the language, to quote again Humboldt, the language with the strongest army. At this moment, this is English, at least for a while. And of course, this situation implies some inequality, even some discrimination, if you like. But even if we wanted to raise awareness on this inequality, we would need to do it in the only language that draws it together, which is English. Artists such as Nicolien van Harskamp and Jacob Ferry, for instance, have tackled this issue beautifully with pieces such as The New Latin by Nicolien van Harskamp and An Artist Who Does Not Speak English Is No Artist by Jacob Ferry, quoting Mladen Stilinovic. As you might have noticed, both these pieces have a title in English. And yet there is something all this does not say, which is how the fact that we're writing in English affects what we are writing. It's an issue as pervasive as the politics of globalized English. We deal with it every time we write, read, or go to a show. And it is also more subtly political. It has to do with empowerment and with self-determination. I was first aware of this when I was self-translating an article. I'd written it in Italian, but it was meant to be published in the English language. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the situation. You work on the translation after you've written the text. You know the text meaning extremely well. The intentions of the author are your intentions. You're also pretty confident that no mistake, at least in terms of grammar, has been made in the translation because you've checked every word correctly. And yet, the final text simply does not sound right. What struck me as fitting original adjectives sounded dull or superfluous in English. Sentences became too long, winding. Most points seemed repetitive, or not even so pointy after all. Of course, this depended on my inability as a translator, at least to a degree. But if you take a look at some Italian, French, or German theory or philosophy books, both written and translated by people much smarter than myself, you will often have a similar feeling. The prose sounds strained and heavy, the argument vague and often too emphatic or flourished to be taken seriously. It's not that you don't understand it, you do. Everything makes perfect sense. It just does not seem so convincing or important anymore. I would really like to be able to offer an example of this, but of course, part of the problem with dealing with this topic is that English is probably the only language that everyone in this room understands. So any example would involve another language and so would not be transparent to a part of the audience. But I can relate an anecdote to this. I was doing for a while a PhD in philosophy in Italy, and as part of a study group, I went on a visit in the US. In order to get a PhD in Italy, you have to write a summary of your topic, your question, which is from 500 to 1,000 words. This is like the most summarized version of what you're studying. So of course, when I was in the US, I had a chance to speak with this incredible philosopher that I had been following for years, and he asked me what my research topic was. And like after 2 minutes that I was speaking, he said it like, if you can't say it shorter than this, you don't have a research topic. You know, this is the so-called elevator pitch. And he wasn't being aggressive. This is what's expected of PhD students in some contexts and in some countries. But on the other hand, if ever I were to summarize my research problem in a single question to my advisor in Italy, he would take it superficially. If you can summarize it, he would consider it superficial. If you can summarize it in a single question, then you're not really aware of how complex the issue is. Who is right? It depends. I mean, it's not just, and here you can see that this is where my Hans Belting part fit in, but I'll just skip this part. There is no way of saying who is right and who is not, and this does not depend on things getting lost in translation. It has to do with something else. I think it's something that we know. By we I mean non-native speakers. Don't take it personally if you're not. We do translate or self-translate or write directly in English, even though we do not command English as well as we would command our native language. And what is wrong with it, what prompted Belting to cut off that chapter altogether, is not a matter of content, but I would say of style. If you take any classic of Italian philosophy or theory, you will be struck by how indirect it is. Its sentences are long and winding, the language is plentiful and dense with metaphors and subordinate clauses. There are a lot of interspersed quotations and appeals to authority, even or especially when they are uncalled for. Merely the average length of the book is much higher than its English language equivalent. This is not a sign of sloppiness or pretentiousness. This is how good theoretical writing is or was done in Italy. No matter how good your argument was, if you didn't dress it up like that, it was taken to be shallow or simplistic or not showing enough research. For the same reason, a lot of recent and not so recent Anglo-Saxon philosophy is considered just that, shallow, in Italian circles. It took decades for the Italian philosophical establishment to accept that analytical philosophy, even though it had short sentences and not many, was something to be taken seriously. I remember a professor at my university saying, defining Bertrand Russell, after he won a Nobel Prize, as some guy who thinks 100 pages are enough to write philosophy about happiness. Most of analytical philosophy was dismissed as an American fad just because of that. It didn't sound right. Of course, the obverse is also true. What in Italian counts as a trapping of good theoretical writing, convolutedness, length, metaphors, quotations, appears in English to derive from sloppy writing, if not actual lack of a point. Most of the time, you crawl your way through a meandering paragraph or an ornate metaphor, and you're taken with a desire of shouting, just get to the point. This is especially remarkable, I think, when you consider a bilingual text, such as a press release, that you find in a gallery or institution in your own country. You read both versions, and both versions make sense to you. The native one sounds just fine, whereas the English one, if it's translated literally, often has something awkward, even slightly pathetic about it, even though you, the reader, are always the same, and the text is too. But this is the problem. In a way, you expect it to change, more than just in terms of language. I think that this has nothing to do with translation at all, if we take translation to mean the process of turning words and sentences into another code. It rather depends on something I would call the intellectual style, the set of parameters and conventions that determine what counts as a good argument, as an effective point, as a well-written paragraph. It is not a matter of what is said, but of how you say it. It's sort of etiquette, if you wish. This intellectual style is culturally specific in ways that are largely independent of the language per se. The Italian intellectual tradition, for instance, takes as its milestones a mix of idealist philosophy of the Kant, Hegel, Croce lineage, and French post-structuralism, which is oddly construed to include Heidegger. Your text, superficially, is supposed to resemble just that. The English-American intellectual style is very far from this, at least today, privileging conciseness and dryness, and showing in general a kind of skepticism towards metaphor and flourish that often reflects on the very quality of the argument. Get to the point. But in a way, as a matter of fact, this distance is only something recent. I ran a textual analysis of the corpus of Frieze issues from the past 20 years, and on James Fraser's The Golden Bough, which at the time was a paragon of intellectual prose from a century ago. The way in which they diverged, both in terms of sentence length and richness of vocabulary, are similar to the ways in which Italian writing and current English writing diverge now. Fraser, too, would probably strike a contemporary reader as convoluted and unnecessarily flourished. When our articles, statements, press releases get translated, their intellectual style does not. This often creates a problem of misunderstanding, even a disadvantage. I was originally acutely aware of this when I was living in Milan 6 or 7 years ago with some artists who were only starting then to exhibit internationally just after graduating, in group shows or sometimes in an art fair. Most of their material was only written in Italian, and they would ask me to translate it into English. I was not a native speaker, but I was at hand and I worked for free. At first, I would translate pedantically, word for word, what they wrote in Italian. But they would come back from the fairs or from the shows telling me that curators or gallerists had complained that their texts were unintelligible or sounded hazy and pretentious, or that they could not really get their line of reasoning. At other times, they'd say someone suggested a rewrite of an edit of their text. And in those cases, they more often than not, felt that the text somehow didn't render the complexity or the depth of what the original Italian had conveyed. With time, I witnessed their texts and their work change. They adapted it to the English discourse, or to the English discourse that they could best approximate. Or they dropped any attempt at explaining it altogether. They would drop most of their original cultural references, leaving only enough for that taste of Mediterraneanness, but not so many as to condition the piece understanding. And all in all, the aspiration, almost everyone's aspiration, is to sound as native as possible. This is pretty much the situation non-native English art writers often find themselves facing. If we go for our native intellectual style, the Italian convoluted one in my case, which we master to a higher degree, we risk alienating an editor or a reader who is expecting something different and feels that our English, while perhaps correct in terms of grammar, has something alien, odd, or just wrong about it. The problem with this is best outlined in a research published last year on Triple Canopy by artist David Levine and sociologist Alex Rule, the international art English piece to which Christina was referring earlier. Levine and Rule analyzed with quantitative methods several years' worth of efflux press releases and underlined in a linguistically precise yet often quite mocking tone all the cliches of art speak or international art English that they could find. We all know about those abstract nouns, useless metaphors, winding paragraphs and sentences, agency attributed to objects, just things that appear to make no sense. I'll quote 2 examples that were included in their original paper. First example. It's even more important to testify that artists and art communities from different parts of the globe are increasingly sharing the common understanding and strategies to reinvent themselves through engagements of the realm of everyday life. More and more artists are magically turning the ordinary into novel forms, meanings and usages, while innovative collective mobilizations are brought to the forefront as a more democratic structure of art practices and their social functions. Second example. Quite unlike the modernist collage, in which various fragments of materials of experience are laid bare, revealed as fissures, voids, unresolvable contradictions, irreconcilable particularizations, pure heterogeneity, I wouldn't know how to pronounce this. The historicist image pursues the opposite aim, that of synthesis, of the illusory creation of unity, of a totality which conceals its historical determination and conditioned particularity. This appearance of a unified pictorial representation, homogeneous in mode, material and style, is treacherous, supplying as it does aesthetic pleasure as a false consciousness. Of course, we can understand why a native speaker would frown at these constructions. Or even make fun of them. And using these as examples, the criticism that Levine and Rule make of international art English is quite strong. Their point is basically that these stylistic trappings are adopted in order to show a competence and to boast a familiarity with the most important theoretical writing that has been done in philosophy and art theory in the past decades. They do not blame them on non-native writers. They blame these trappings on, I quote, American interns mimicking the Derrida they've read in a bad English translation, end quote. Their position has a point. Texts such as these can be frustrating to read, at times bordering on the ungrammatical. But they do not take into account that those press releases might, in fact, have been written by non-natives. If they sound like French, it could very well be not because someone was misguidedly, deliberately wanting to sound like that in order to acquire status. Maybe they were French and just sounded like themselves. As a matter of fact, of these two, the excerpts that I read, the second was from an American art school, and the first was from a text by Huan Ru, who does not really need to display status. The fact that such possibility was not even addressed in the research points at a deeper and perhaps more dangerous misunderstanding. The idea that English is ultimately a native-only affair, in which non-native speakers are at best tolerated guests, provided they can respect the rules, which have to do with grammar, but not only. And not only this, what this explanation fails to consider is that a construction that sounds foreign or complex to a native might actually sound more transparent to someone from a different background. The word I could not pronounce before, homogeneity, actually I understood it immediately because it's, I guess, much more common in Italian and in French than it is in English. I know from experience that Italians often have an easier time understanding English when it is written by French or Spanish. In the same way, I live in Germany, and in my experience, I know that Germans often frown on the Austrian accent. They say it's like ununderstandable. They pronounce R's in a very strange way. But to me, it sounds much easier to understand. It's slower, and it just translates better into written. Something similar, I guess, might be true for other language combinations of which I'm not aware. Not all texts written by non-natives are like those analyzed by Levine and Rule. Often the original intellectual style gets edited out during the process of publication to avoid sounding too foreign. This is what happens most often, at least in my experience, when working with native editors. But this too comes with a cost, that of vagueness, lack of spirit, subtracting something without adding anything back. If the Derrida-style international English had too many specific influences, it was a sum of two or several languages. The language after the editing often has too few. It is a common denominator, and as such it is quite small. I spoke about this with Caroline Schneider, the publisher of Sternberg Press. As we were somewhat acquainted, I sent her a mail with some of my concerns about native English after reading the ad I talked about later, upon deciding not to apply. And she was extremely kind and extremely open in discussing these concerns. And she told me that while they do have a policy of only hiring native editors, as most magazines and publishing houses I'm aware of, their final product seldom respects all the requirements of proper English writing, since the authors come from all different backgrounds and nationalities, and there's only so much in terms of normalization that an editor can do. Caroline Schneider also told me that this was a problem for them as well. Their books, she said, sometimes get negative reviews in the press, in the English press, because of their language. It's too simplistic, it's too plain. It doesn't fit the intellectual style, all right. The reviewers, English or American, did not take into account that those books were not written exactly in their language, and they were not written in another language and translated. They're written in the international version of English. This is how I feel most of my English texts are. This is how I'm speaking right now and how Christina, I guess, was speaking before. Of course, in a way, those reviewers were right. In some ways, international English does not respect the codes and conventions, sometimes not even the grammar of English proper. And yet, those conventions are shaped by a community that is only a small subset of the larger group of people who use the language and have a stake in it. A group that includes English and American artists, but also Finnish writers and Japanese artists and Lebanese curators. This is not only unfair in the same way that taxation without representation was unfair to American settlers, it might also be counterproductive. In complying to the Queen's English standards developed with a smaller community of native speakers in mind, we might be losing something in terms of expressive power and flexibility, without gaining anything back in return, except the approval of some people who happen to be born on an island in Northern Europe. In a way, this standard is already changing. Art critic Jennifer Allen recently wrote in a column on Frieze that her style is changing in order to take into account the magazine's international readership. Similarly, even though they're not hiring non-native editors for the moment, books by Sternberg and other similar publishers are implicitly pushing for an acceptance of a different, more varied way of understanding international English. If this acceptance is slow to come, and for the moment sometimes takes the form of refusal or mockery, as we have seen. It's just that language transformation is extremely slow. But it is happening in a way, and I guess it's up to non-natives to raise awareness on this. Now we can finally go back to this guy. His translation of the Bible, called the Vulgate, which means delivered to the people, but also means has the same root of vulgar, was hated by intellectuals, of course, and mocked for its lack of refinement and linguistic complexity. This had to do with the original text, but also with the language he chose to translate it. And yet, the evolution of Latin into Italian, French, Portuguese, Spanish, Dalmatian, Romanian, and so on, owes much more to this style than to that of Cicero, because most of the people who spoke vulgar had learned it from there. The comparison between English and Latin is mostly misplaced. The Neo-Latin languages came to be used by a population that did not have a largely dominant written tradition as we have now. But it can serve as an example of how languages evolve, not among the applause and ratification of grammarians, but through mockery. It is not something you see happening, but it's something that is acknowledged once it has already happened. There were just two small of how this acknowledgement can take place that I wanted to quote at the end of my talk. The first is something that I did with a magazine and collective based in Rotterdam called Fucking Good Art. Rob and Nienke, the team of Fucking Good Art, were devoting an issue 2 years ago to the Italian artistic landscape. This issue that later was published under the title Italian Conversations, Art in the Age of Berlusconi, took the form of a collection of, also included a collection of interviews and conversation with Italian practitioners, often from an underground or not really internationally recognized background. I was asked to help out with the translations of these conversations into English. Of course, by all standards, they should have been done by a native. Originally, they were. And yet, some specificities of the interviews required my intervention. There was some old 70s political jargon, there was a lot of dialects that a translator would not expect to understand. And in the end, Rob and Nienke felt that some of it should have been done by an Italian because it would be rendered best. And also because, as Dutch artists writing in English, they too felt the need to expand somehow this linguistic standard we're used to. Still, in order to warn readers that the language they would find in the book might sound different from what they'd expect, we agreed to add a short informational preface explaining this. We titled it A Note on the English, just as some books have a similar page called A Note on the Font. The idea here too is that you can use many different ones and each has a story, which should be explained. The thing I would like to end my talk with is a project that has been made very recently by artist Nicolien van Harskamp, to which I referred to before. It's called English Forecasts, and it has been part of the BMW Tate Live performance series. It was aired actually 3 weeks ago. It is a series, it involves a series of non-native English speakers pronouncing sentences that they hear spoken by non-native English speakers of a different background, pronouncing them aloud in the camera, and after giving a short pause for the reader for the viewer to repeat the sentence, just as you would normally do when learning a language with a visual or audio material. The idea is that the overlapping of the different influences that English is being subjected to right now can somehow project an idea of what the future development of international English might be. The whole video is available on YouTube and on the Tate website. I prepared a small excerpt that I think is relevant to what we're saying now. Oh. Okay, how does this work? View, enter full screen. It lasts about a minute.
I agree with this. Even though they were not colonized by the English, they feel like it is colonizing language.
We didn't have a choice at the beginning.
We just learned it.
English has to be certified, tested, and that's the problem I have with.
You could say that without it, you are not going to be very successful.
And maybe that is a top-down thing.
Non-native English is very bad for your career. So here applies the notion preemptive obedience.
Without having been asked to speak correctly,
To write scientific articles like Americans do?
is not necessary, but people are offering it all the time.
Do I want to write an article and to be published it without editing of a mother tongue?
But if they didn't want it, they would marshal themselves together.
I have an action against English.
I'm not optimistic. English, it helped to come together. But it does not unite us.
If we appropriate English, then this power thing goes.
But as long as we attribute power to the native speakers, they will have it.
And now we should repeat this. Thank you very much.
This was well, it was very interesting to just listen to your talk, Vincenzo. Because, of course, indeed, like we're all talking in this strange language. And my fascination lately has been, indeed, with this movement that might happen inside, or how this movement of switching, as you say, personalities, maybe from English to Italian, or to all different languages, and how that might occur within you. What would that movement mean, actually? Lately, I've been very interested about the body as a site of language, because, of course, even in writing about art and all these things that Vincenzo described, somehow they still happen in our body. I was talking earlier with some of you how this is a common feeling, for example, when you are learning a new language, of the idea of not being able to say a lot of the things that you want. And there is the sensation that they are stuck in your mouth, or maybe in your limbs, and at the moment that they are about to be processed, the moment has already gone. Maybe a similar thing can be said of unlearning one's language. Of course, living in the Netherlands for many years, I have unlearned my Italian, very much so. You suddenly forget, or just words disappear. You always say, like, I have it on the tip of my tongue, but somehow it's not coming. Isn't that insane? This reflection, you see, unfortunately, also for an art historian, I'm not being very generous with images. The talk of today will focus on a kind of several stories that relate to these fascinations. Some of them have been in dialogue, actually, with artists. But as in terms of images, I will be presenting only a couple of black and white images, which is a bit unfortunate, but they have incredible stories in them. One aspect that interested me a lot was the idea of the tongue. We mentioned, Christina was mentioning it, and of course Vincenzo too. And of course the tongue, what is the tongue? Like, why is language connected to the tongue? Suddenly it became this organ, or has been for a long time, the organ of language. I must say that also switches through time. For example, in the Middle Ages, a big organ for language was the heart. And there are many texts, starting already from the writings of St. Augustine, which specifically link language to the heart, especially the language of God, as something that is inscribed in your heart. And initially, it's actually even more in the area between your heart and your lungs. So these physical aspects change. But the tongue has this big symbolical connection, always the tongue. So as I was preparing for this talk, I was actually driving around the Mississippi River alongside Mississippi and Louisiana. So maybe it was one of the best places to consider reading the Bible. And I started looking into the image of the tongue in the Bible. Why the Bible? I'm an art historian, of course, and somehow a lot of the images that I deal with are inevitably embedded in the history of Christianity, as is the history of art, perhaps. starting with a big cliche of misinterpretation. In the beginning was the Logos, and how is it really the Logos? Is Logos what Heraclitus wrote about, or is it the word, the verb, what the Bible talks about? But I mean, that's our history of that misinterpretation. We cannot leave it behind. Anyway, the Bible can be very conflictual about the tongue. The tongue is both a very negative space as it is a place of possession. So I read now from James, the book of James, the naming of the tongue. When we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. Or take ships for an example. Although they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are steered by a very small rudder wherever the pilot wants to go. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue is also a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course at one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. Imagine. All kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and sea creatures are being tamed, have been tamed by mankind. But no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. Yet, so this is a whole kind of decaying image of the tongue. Yet this is also via the tongue that, you know, in the Bible, like humans praise the Lord, or in the whole Christianity. So it kind of embodies this both rejection of divinity and affirmation of divinity. It is also via the tongue that the Logos of God goes out into the world. I'll come to that later. Of course, maybe, as many of you know, one of the most fascinating things in recent time has been the increase of evangelical movements throughout the world. It's actually one of the largest increasing religious groups. And an interesting aspect of that is this concept of Pentecostal movement of the speaking in tongues. So, speaking in tongues is a moment that occurred during the Pentecost, so the ascension of the word, and suddenly people could start speaking in different languages. So, I don't know, I would start speaking Turkish, for example, or I don't know, you would start speaking a forgotten language. So I read here that has been often conflictual, what speaking in tongues, whether it's positive or negative. For Paul, and the letter in the Corinthians is very also negative about speaking in tongues. He says it's of course speaking in tongues, it happens, God is speaking to you, but what purpose is there to speak in tongues if no one understands you? You should be able to articulate clearly the work of God. Yet for the Acts of the Apostles in chapter 2, a much more positive part is taken, and I will just read, this is the last passage I will read for the moment. When Pentecost Day came around, they all met together, when suddenly there came from heaven a sound as of violent wind, which filled the entire houses in which they were sitting. And there appeared to them tongues as of fire. They separated and came to rest on the head of each of them. They were all filled with the Holy Spirit, and began to speak different languages, as the Spirit gave them power to express themselves. Now there were devout men living in Jerusalem from every nation under heaven, and then it goes assembling a list of nations and different languages. One was amazed and perplexed. They asked one another what it all meant. Some, however, laughed it off. They have been drinking too much new wine, they said. Now, of course, this is, I don't want to enter into a theological discussion, but the idea of being possessed by tongue is not something which is only being discussed within theological matters. Maybe we are often possessed by different languages or by different tongues, and this is maybe what I'm aiming to, the switch of personalities. How does that happen? I remember, for example, when you were mentioning all the American students reading Derrida, I guess that is something for many of us can account. Last year in February in Venice, I had to talk about letters and dreams, and I was looking into my correspondence with a friend of mine, which was written during the period that I was just as a philosophy student reading the Spectres of Marx. And I could see in my epistolar mode of writing that I was somehow totally possessed by this language. It was almost speaking through me, and I guess maybe there was some kind of speaking in tongue for me. It wasn't my usual self. When I was reading them back, I was almost ashamed. What was I writing? What is this? Like, we're all these complicated words in the text. Why? Well, so this was one of the episodes I wanted to talk about. How does this transformation happen? And then the way we think about language today, of course, is not so much embodied in us, or we are often used to more abstract ideas, or even a pragmatic way as a way of communication. What is language? I wanted to recount a story from the Byzantine culture. And again, please forgive, there are lapses of dilettantism in my talk, as I am not a Byzantologist, nor a specialist of what I'll talk later. Logos in the Byzantine culture would have multiple meaning. It can signify the word, the verb, writing, divine utterance, commandment, law, sermon, and literature. In theological terms, it is Christ that is the divine logos, who descends, he's logos, so it's like word, and descends into the world and receives flesh in the womb of the Virgin. And this is a very important transformation. We're now looking at the frontispiece of a mid-12th century manuscript of sermons written by Gregory of Nazianzus. Is it clear? Yeah, well. Unfortunately, although there is such a big proliferation of images on the internet, for example, it's always difficult to find good images of those. Okay. In the upper right corner, Christ, the Logos, offers divine inspiration and blesses the writing. So you see, maybe I should. So you see there the writer, he's sitting. There is a pavement of marble. Marble is quite an important element. He has this little chair, and then there is a desk with a scriptus which is standing on a column. You won't see very well, but it is empty, but it is outlined. Well, in his hand, he's holding an empty sheet of paper. It's not outlined at all. His pen is ready. It's about to have the action of writing. Indeed, on the left corner, you'll see, do you see a small Jesus coming out of the frame? Yeah. So he has the word in his hand, and he's also pointing with his fingers as about a moment of speech. So he's about to give speech. The whole setting, of course, is predominant. The color gold is quite predominant. It's framed in a sort of city. You see also little trees, but then it also becomes a church, so it's actually quite connected, the church and the city in one. And then on the top of the whole painting, you see the Virgin Mary seated with Christ. Can you see that? Yeah. This codex was commissioned by the abbot of a Pantocrator monastery in Constantinople around 1136 and was offered as a book. It is somehow, it tells a story, of course, of this moment of just before writing, but it's almost a pictorial expression of complex figures of speech. As such, this miniature exemplifies the characters of the new style of painting that developed in Byzantium in the 11th and 12th century. Again, Hans Belting comes back because he's one of the writers that, an artist that wrote a lot about this new style of painting. But for some scholars, the frontispiece displays the process of creation and writing as an act of building and giving birth. Perhaps, I say, it's a visual ekphrasis. This is the literary genre, which was the description of artworks, which was quite common during the Byzantine period, but goes back to the Iliad. A first description, for example, of the Orc of Arc, we could say, is the shields, a description of the shields of Aquila in Homerus. Because it's trying to depict, it's like the depiction of the work of art. The front image is static, but its pictorial structure triggers the viewer to embark on a journey into an imagined space. There is somehow a kind of tension between the natural world and the abstracted world, the gold, the marble, and then the persons in it. And it is maybe this duality that gives rise to the power of speech. The marble also engaged an idea already expressed in Gregory's oration himself. He's going to write that on the next page, we are not seeing it. He writes, "We desire not the words that flow through the air and reach the ears, but those that the Holy Spirit wrote and impressed on slabs of stone and rather on slabs of flesh. Words drawn not on the surface, but easily erased and easily erasable, but imprinted in depth, not in ink, but in grace." In this text, Gregory, the writer that we see there, juxtaposes the spoken words that are publicly pronounced by the orator and reach only the ears of the listeners with the divine logos imprinted on slabs of flesh. The divine logos is not a word inscribed on the surface, created in relief, but a uniform surface of patterns which is imprinted in the flesh of the writer. The veined marbles even act as a negation of the common notion of the figure. They almost offer a negative theology. So also the whole idea of Christ being incarnated in the world as logos and in the icon is very much connected with notion of presence as absence in Byzantine iconography, in the sense that it is not that the presence is there. We have the abstractness of Christ, and it's only because it's longing towards the real logos that it is an icon. Is that clear somehow? Okay. Maybe I wanted to use the words of Didier Huberman. It is crisis into the semblance, the unfigurable in the figure. Didier Huberman is a French art historian. He was writing this actually on Fra Angelico, who is a later Italian Renaissance painter. But in here I see even more the allusion to the ultimate mystery of the incarnation. In juxtaposing naturalism and abstraction, both expressions of desire to picture the invisible in a visual form, the miniature here, the codex, presents a paradox. Divine presence is revealed in the interval between semblance and dissemblance. I already said earlier that somehow it makes me think also of the idea of language the coming of language in the body as a pregnant body. And it is very important that we see there at the top the image of the Virgin. Of course, when we look at that, it's a virgin enthroned, sitting on the throne with Jesus Christ. But to the Byzantine audience, it would have also meant different things. For example, it also conjures up the image of giving birth. Unlike the standard practice of the mother lying down while giving birth, a parturient woman in the medieval period and also in the Byzantine culture sat. In these positions, she was often assisted by the forces of gravity. So actually, there are many depictions I'm not showing today of people giving birth in this position. So the enthroned virgin and child also functions as an idealized version of the act of giving birth, where pain is absent in this case, and the infant already calm in her lap. Because indeed, Christ descends in the world in the form of carnal logos, he becomes a material manifestation of wisdom. So childbirth, especially the divine childbirth, of which is present here, is almost synonymous with creation. And one could see an analogy between the pregnant Mary and somehow the pregnant Gregoris, who is about to write. Now, what kind of writing? How can one be? Of course, he is writing about divine matters, but I thought it was very interesting to see in this. And let me show you another image. Sorry. Yes. How can I be so bad with this? I was very interested in this physicality, the body as the site of language, hence the whole incarnation of the Logos in Christ, and as depicted in that specific manuscript interested me particularly. Another element that keeps coming back somehow in my stories and in my thoughts is the idea of the ingestion of words, or eating words, eating one's words, in my case. And this also has to be found in citations in the Bible. There is, for example, the famous story from Prophet Ezekiel when he actually describes the act of eating the scroll. I cite again. And he said to me, "Son of man, eat what is before you, eat this scroll, then go and speak to the people of Israel." So I opened my mouth, and he gave me the scroll to eat. Then he said to me, "Son of man, eat this scroll I am giving you, will fill your stomach with it." So I ate it, and it tasted as sweet as honey in my mouth. So imagine words or a scroll, eating one scroll that tastes as sweet as honey. I don't know, I think maybe when in early stages of learning, people sometimes have close connections with books. For example, sometimes you might sleep with a book next to your bed as you're trying to finish it, or you still have this kind of feeling that knowledge might be transferred to you by just being close to the object. Often also with people is the same. And yet this concept of actually eating it, incorporating it in your body, where would these words stay? How would they taste as honey? But a similar thing you see depicted in this other manuscript. Is a bit earlier, this case, is the 10th century. And that is also a writer, a poet, Romanus the melodist. He's a hymnographer, actually. And he has a dream. He's asleep. You cannot see it, but he's lying on a red cloth. And then suddenly from the back, you see the Virgin coming, yeah? And she has the halo as well. And what she's actually carrying in her hand is also a scroll to give him. So already here, like this idea of transmitting the words is still again connected with the nativity scene of the Virgin Mary, and in this direct transmutation of the word directly to the body. Romanos also eats it, and then after he's able to write beautiful romantic hymns. And of this situation of the Virgin Mary, actually there was in this site, it's also depicted. Yeah, there was a monastery. Many people and poets used to go for inspirations. There is even the famous, and again, maybe I'm going back to cliches, but Anna Komnena, the typical, one of the major historians of Byzantine time during Byzantology, the princess. She also writes about it, and she says, "In the past, you mistress gave to Romanos, your servant, to eat the written scroll. Now fill my cup, O Virgin, with the sweet drink of wisdom, for I am thirsty of it. Make me drink profusely, because it will moisten my parched brain." And I keep this image and keep the idea of the drinking in your mind and of eating the words, but now we're moving in a totally different direction. We're going in New York in the 1970s. In New York, there was a man named Louis Wolfson, an author and occasional mental hospital patient, whose writings were discovered in the late 60s by Gilles Deleuze. Wolfson is a Jewish New Yorker. He's now quite an old man, but he was born in 1939, so he was around in a young man there, like in the late 30s. He's a Jewish New Yorker who not only is obsessed with French words, he writes entirely in French, the language of a place to which he has never been. He has a weird behavior. He's obsessed with killing his mother tongue. He writes about it extensively. He writes this book, famous somehow, or read for a period of time, now a bit forgotten, called Le Schizo et la Langue. And it's a book written in the third person about his own experiences with his mother tongue, an almost literary sense. He's not able to tolerate his mother, and somehow he's unable to tolerate his mother's tongue, and he physically suffers from it in the body. He calls himself a student, a schizophrenic student of languages, and a student of schizophrenic languages. He describes a complex linguistic system for survival, which consists in deforming words from his mother tongue, translating them through systematic phonetic alterations, first into French, and eventually into a purely fictional language involving French, German, Hebrew, and Yiddish. And it is very strange for me to speak of him in English, a language he detests. I discovered his writing via an artist, actually, Munira. We had often talked about the physicality of language and how can the translation of language also be felt in the body. She speaks French. I read French. Translation was always a bit of a problem. A very important element for Louis Wolfson is the fact that he has problem with the ingestion of words. So not only is he describing how much his ears hurt or how much pain he is when he's constantly open to English, but he even has problem with eating food, which is in English containers. He's incapable of eating food with English labels, as he is of hearing the English language. His mother, with an uncanny sense of how to pierce his defenses, is constantly bombarding him with food, not raw food products, but especially labeled food, packages, cartons, jars, boxes, bottles. When he gives in to temptation and ingests, he becomes heavy and dumb, losing his concentration and ability to learn languages. Learning in his mind is the only act constitutive of his fragile self. It's an interesting thing that he actually does not pursue French culture, either in time, like he's not talking so much about French literature or in an elite manner. Again, we're in the 60s in New York. French is like the way to be. All people who are going to university would like to speak French. There is a whole big image of France as this cultural consumption. There are places, French restaurants are the places to be. Many people are meeting to have to go to summer in France, to have their European trip. Wolfson is not interested in that at all. Instead, he's walking around with a headphone in which he can listen to foreign voices, with dictionaries and with obscure scientific texts that he consults from the public library. Somehow, though, his French, what is interesting when you were talking about what the language he is making, is very different from the French that normally is spoken about or is written. There are many instances when he's actually trying to talk with real French people and he almost is scared. He doesn't want to, he's almost feeling misunderstood by them. He's more passionate about the process of translation into French, which is also connected with different languages like German and Yiddish. Maybe I should just give you one small example, and then I think I'm already running out of time. Yes. He has to drink milk. His mother has brought him a bottle of milk, which is a new milk. And he notices in the new container, he notices a word he does not want to see, of the American connection. It is written, the word in question is edge, pronounced with the final edge, meaning bored, in French in this case. In a long-standing procedure, the psychotic at almost each encounter with this world did his utmost to immediately change it to German, Ende. And I'm citing him, well, my translation of his French into English. Of which, meanwhile, the etymological parent exists in English and, both signing beau, extrémité, terme, and similar such things. Thus, this German word was strongly familiar to him. Nonetheless, he tried to be content with thinking of it when hearing English edge. At the very last, German Ende was the first word, if not also the last that came to his mind in this case. This without doubt because it was so well known to him and somewhat analogous in meaning and somewhat similar visually to the English word to be found at the corner of the cover of the container of the skimmed milk. The two words having 3 out of 4 letters in common, for each contained a D followed as well as preceded by an E. Somehow, I don't understand how clear it is, this whole process of translation. Maybe it's not even important. Now I'm quite familiar with it, but what is interesting that he's talking in between tongues, or he's trying to create a language in between tongues. And maybe this is what fascinated all the post-structuralist thinkers so much with his writing and his existence. The words are not symbols for him, and maybe perhaps exactly as for our writer, Romanos the melodist, they do not stand for something else. They are physical, they speak for themselves. They are, and perhaps sometimes they cannot speak, but get stuck in the mouth. They poison the tongue, sour the throat, kill the voice. They consume meaning, and they render it worthless. Perhaps this idea of the Byzantine language as a kind of cosmological conceptual concept. So this sounds very big word, but could be still related today to the way we're thinking about the body as a site of language in both art historical as well as in artistic forms. I think those are the stories for today, and thank you.
Hello. Yeah, thank you, Arnisa, for this trip through the Bible to different kind of art historical paintings, which I haven't seen in a very long time. To remind me of of how, language could be represented through the scroll. That's quite an interesting idea, because I was thinking a little bit about the idea of the speech bubble a while ago. So this kind of could have quite an interesting correlation. And of course, juxtaposed next to Vincenzo's whole conversation about this kind of fragmentation of English itself, or like the contamination of English, and bringing together with Lewis Wolfson's idea of somehow an assault, say, to kill the mother tongue. It's like collecting all these different tongues to kind of destroy that tongue that in his head. I don't know if there's time for questions. There's 2 questions, so maybe if anyone has a super urgent question.
Yeah, thank you, both of you. That was amazing and very interesting. And I was very interested when you were speaking in the beginning, Vincenzo, and all I kept thinking was the desire, it seemed like you seemed to have a very a democratic imperative almost in the way that you conceive of language, as if language needs to appeal to the most amount of people at one time. Do you see what I'm saying? There's many people, we want to understand language, and I kept thinking of the word logos, which is why I was so happy that you brought it up in your half of the talk. So I'm wondering, how important is audience in language? Is English functional simply because it enables a larger audience? Not to say that we need to privilege American English or whatever, but is that one thing that it does enable that's very positive for us?
Yeah, I mean, of course, this is I think this is maybe it's something I should have, it was of course the starting point of all this, is that the idea is that as soon as something relevant to you is said in a language, you are somehow allowed to claim a stake in it, especially all the more, and as this was quite evident also in Nicolene's piece, if what goes on in that language, both in terms of your reception and of your own production, has an impact on, even like some practical aspects of your life that involve like your job opportunities, your possibilities of moving away. And I guess that this is ultimately what my talk was about. Of course, like the comparison with the no taxation without representation slogan of that like gave rise to the American independence is quite strong. But at the same time, I see that there is a point to that. Like at this moment, as the community of users and the community of, let's say, coders of the language do not completely overlap. And the idea is that, I don't know if it's about a democratization, but it's like a ratification of the fact that you don't need a special authorization in order to claim a stake in a language beyond it being important to you. I don't know if this answer, I don't know if, was this what you were?
I guess because one of the things I kept thinking was, why does language have to be understood? Why does language have to imply a logo? So why can't we just have language that we don't necessarily understand? Like, I've sat through many movies I don't understand, and I understand contextually what's happening, and I enjoy that, and I learn language that way. So maybe it's I guess maybe it's just a different understanding. Why does language have to be productive?
It's a very good question, but at the same time, it's of course you can make a philosophical point of this, which would be extremely interesting. But there is also something quite banal and pathetic, and that I don't mean to sound aggressive when saying it, is that we here can wonder about this. If you go to some parts of southern Italy to someone who does not speak English and is fixed in the job market, where the unemployment ratio for our age class is above 40%, then you might frame the mutual understanding argument in slightly different tones. I think that this is part of the subtext. This is also why I decided to start, even though there was something objectionable about it. I decided to start with an actual job offer problem, because I think some of it boils down to that. Of course, you will eventually have or you will assume the free market to deliver to you the best products of literature and film and theory in your own language. Hopefully it will, if your country is big enough to support a thriving publishing industry. But this is a luxury. This is like a second part. In many cases, the mutual understanding is also something that is necessary for some more basic aspects of life than just enjoying high culture in a way.
I think what Lee brought up about this, why does language have to be productive? I think that's really interesting when you can connect back to what Lewis Wolfson was doing. It makes sense only to himself.
Yeah, but I was thinking that being not necessarily communicative at first glance, it doesn't necessarily disclose economical power or some kind of productivity within capitalist society. I can imagine even for Wolfson, having this language that no one really understood, or well, some people actually understand it, had its economical vantage points as well. Well, his story is actually very, very strange, because of course he didn't make much money by publishing this book. Well, it was published by Gallimard, but a couple of years later he won the lottery and he now lives in Puerto Rico, so I guess it brought him something.
Thank you, Arnessa, Christina.